All right. You know, there was a moment in our last session when the question was posed: what does successful integration look like, more or less? And you could hear a collective gasp in the room, and I think that was probably a mixture of people who have had to struggle with this in a scholarly setting to try to define what that might mean amid all of the possible indicators. It is probably people who have had to deal with this in a practical context to know how complex that question is, and I think it's also a reminder of the kind of in many ways, for both the community and for individuals, this is a very subjective judgment. What does that mean? And if you set a standard for what integration means that is so high that almost everyone would fail it, are you really setting your priorities well as a society and from a policy perspective? And that is why I'm really glad we have this third session arranged, because it will help us to look at this question not only from the governmental, the policy, and the practitioner perspective that we've heard in the first two sessions today, but also from experiences. And we are really delighted to have had with us this week at the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies 10 participants in a diversity leadership exchange program. I'll say a word about that just because I wouldn't expect all of you to be familiar with it, but this is a program we've been carrying out for the last 4 years, in which we bring together young leaders from a migrant background, from the United States and from Germany. We have found this to be an extremely stimulating and enriching program for us, because it helps us understand Germany and the United States better, but also to help build networks of people who will remain and have remained active on issues either in their communities or in a transatlantic context. So we're very pleased to be able to carry out this program. And so on our next and concluding session, we will have 4 of those participants, 2 German, 2 American, to talk about their experiences. And we are especially pleased to have Maritza Perez from the Center for American Progress as the chair of this session. So I'd like to invite our participants and Maritza to come up right now, and Maritza will do the honors of introducing the 4 panelists. But just a word about her: she is a senior policy analyst for criminal justice reform at the Center for American Progress. And before joining CAP, she was a legislative staff attorney at the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. So she has experience in this field that will help her guide us through this conversation. And with that, let me turn the floor and the microphone over to you, Maritza.
Thank you. Thank you all for inviting me to be here. So I'm actually an alumna of the diversity program that Jeff just described. I did the program, I believe, 2016. It was a really transformative experience for me. My cohort at the time had the very fortunate privilege of traveling to Berlin and learning about the integration experience in Germany, something that I hadn't been exposed to. But what that did for me was it allowed me to see the parallels between the US and in other places. And also it actually gave me an appreciation for how much the US has come along in this space. I think, I'm a social justice activist, a civil rights lawyer by training. So for me, I'm always, I think, looking at the bad stuff, like what we're not doing right. But that experience let me know that while we do have some work to do, there's also a lot that we're doing here that could be really helpful to other countries that are grappling with this. And just to give you all a little bit more about my background, other than what was already given. So I think it's really important to share migrational backgrounds and migrational history, just because that's what we're going to be talking about here on this panel. So I'm a first-generation American. I was born in Mexico. I happened to be born in Mexico because my family was visiting other family that we still had in Mexico, and I was born early. My mom was not very happy about that because that meant that I was born in Mexico and had to become a US citizen. So at the time, my family was actually living undocumented here in the US. And my mom actually brought me to the US undocumented when I was still a baby. She literally tells me I was in her arms and she crossed the border with me. But the border was a different time, or it was different in that time, I should say. So this was late 80s. The border wasn't militarized like it is now. And she said that because she was a young mom with a newborn, that when she did encounter Border Patrol agents, they left her alone because they're like, there's no way like this young girl with a baby just crossed the border. But in fact, she had. And I'm always really grateful for that experience. I know for my mom, she wouldn't say the same thing because she struggled really hard to get me citizenship. But I think because of that, like I always understood the struggle of being not only undocumented, but somebody from a migrational background. And I saw how hard she worked to become a citizen and all the studying she had to do, the tests she had to take, and really just the entire process. Because before that, she had to get her green card, and that was an entire process. So I really grew up with an appreciation for what it takes to be a citizen of the US. And because of that experience, I always knew I wanted to be in civil rights. I ended up doing criminal justice reform because I saw the parallels between our immigration system and our criminal justice system. I was always somebody who was for immigrant rights and very active in the immigration reform movement. But when I went to law school, I really started to see the parallels between what's happening in the immigration space and in the criminal justice space, where we're taking populations that are underserved, that are minority populations, and placing them in conditions of confinement. And in addition to that, while I was in law school, I also had a family member go to prison, a family member who is also undocumented. And in this country, any violation of the law, whether it be a misdemeanor or a felony, can put you on the path to deportation. So for me, it just made it more clear that there needed to be more voices in the criminal justice reform space who also understood the immigration context. So that's a little bit about me, but I was hoping that each of the panelists could also introduce themselves and just speak a little bit about your migrational backgrounds, and then I'll jump into the questions.
Hi, my name is Maisal Khafaji. I'm from Stuttgart, Germany, and I study political science at the Friedrich-Alexander University in Nuremberg-Erlangen. And I happen to be born in Jordan, but my parents are from Iraq, so I'm not born in Germany, neither in Iraq, in Jordan. And people speak a lot about where are you born? And I'm like, Jordan, and I'm not really connected to Jordan, so I connect to her story a little bit. And yes, I work for the Junge Islam Konferenz. It's a young platform for young people about Islam-related topics, but I also work on Muslim-Jewish relations. And yes, I'm here. I'm very grateful, and thank you for giving us a voice.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gustavo Lopez. I am originally from Jalisco, Mexico, and I grew up in Chicago. And just to also give some background on my migration history, I was born in rural Mexico. My dad and my grandfather before that had been migrating to the US. They're part of the generation that were in the Bracero program as guest workers, working in the fields and the steel mills around Chicago. My dad would travel to the US, first illegally, to work cutting grass at a golf course and then returning home for a few months a year. So growing up, I only saw my dad just a few weeks. And when I was 10, we were fortunate enough to have a visa to go to the US, and I grew up in Chicago. I'm now a graduate student at the University of California, San Diego, where I studied public policy, and I focus on migration policy. Before that, I was working here in DC for 3 years at the Pew Research Center, where I also studied migration.
Hi, my name is Victoria Ochoa. I am from the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, which is on the Texas-Mexico border, for those of you who don't know. Where I come from, there's a saying that we didn't cross the border crossed us, referring, of course, to the fact that where I live once was Mexico. And on my maternal side, that might actually be true because we don't really know when we got here. On my paternal side, both my grandparents were born in Mexico, though my grandmother was soon after adopted by her uncle who had migrated during the Mexican Revolution. So have a interesting family history that I think touches on some key points of Mexican American history. Currently, I am a law student at the University of Pennsylvania, where I am increasingly interested and focused on border militarization and the application of human rights in border zones as globally borders harden, become militarized, and people who happen to live in those regions, both migrants and citizens, their rights are often violated.
Hello, my name is Edip Uzun. I'm born in Mannheim, which is in Baden-Württemberg in Germany, and I moved to Berlin for my bachelor studies in 2015. I studied political science at the Freie University of Berlin, and now I'm studying public policy at the Hertie School of Governance. My background or migration background, let me start that the first person who came to Germany from my family was my great grandmother, and so following this path, I would be the fourth generation in Germany. And my mother is also born in Germany, and so yeah, these roots are quite deep in German history.
Great. I'm actually going to go back to you, Edip. I see that you've written a lot about guest workers, Turkish guest workers in Germany, and I was hoping you could speak a little bit about that and what that. I know you've spoke personally about your parents being guest workers as well, and how that's informed your perspective on integration and what still could be done in Germany.
Yeah, I would again begin with my great-grandmother here. So in 1961, there was this agreement between Germany and Turkey to bring Turkish guest workers to Germany. And my great-grandmother came in 1963 as one of the first women coming to Germany. And at that time, many workers were needed in Germany. However, they often had bad working conditions, also for the decades after. But she is always happy about coming to Germany. However, the next generation, so for example, my dad, who came to Germany as a child, of course, visited school in Germany and had to learn the language. And he also struggled quite a lot because, well, for example, often there are these discussions in Germany, and it's different in several states in Germany as education system is different. But one teacher told him that he should not attend gymnasium, which is the high-track school leading to university, because he would take the place of a German going there. And with these frames, this continued. Also, depending on the current or the economic situation of Germany in the several decades. So in the 60s, workers were needed, economy was growing in Germany, but when we go to the 70s, early 70s, there was a stop of attracting Turkish guest workers, for example. And in the 80s, they even got money to go back to Turkey, which one side of my family did. So my grandpa, who moved to Turkey, decided to go this track. But what I also learned from the history of my family in Germany and Turkey is that life changes and you do not expect it to change, because in the agreement I told you about in 1961, it said that the Turkish guest workers come to Germany for 2 years and then they have to return. And what is interesting is that the German companies said to the German government, let's change that in very early times, because of course, they trained the guest workers, and they did not want to send them back and train the next ones and send them back and so on. Yeah, so when I see this history of how my family came to Germany, I also see that times change a lot. Yeah, when I grew up, that was again another time. Shall I continue here? Or
Yeah,
do a break?
what changes are you talking about specifically?
Yeah. Well, when I was in the first school, so the first 4 years in school, there were many children with migrant background, for example. But the higher I got in the academic world, the less people with migration background I could see. And this is one aspect. Another aspect is that, of course, the ones who go this higher track maybe often are confronted with the questions of not belonging. I experienced a situation where a person asked me, well, we were doing some fundraising for a party at school, and it was for Abitur, so the graduation at the gymnasium. And she asked me, what are you collecting money for? And I said Abitur, and she was very surprised that I did this school path. And that was, yeah, one of the interesting situations I had. Today, I often think about the question, how long or how many generations do we want to count? So, I mean, I said it's now the 4th generation, but does the 10th generation still has to count or not? And what I would also say, and that is a final point, that looking back, structural change happens, but it takes time, as the professor already said before. And this is also a reason why I would be quite optimistic about the future, because these changes go with every generation, I would say. And the more generations are born in Germany, the more integrated maybe they become. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It actually made me think of a conversation I had with someone I did the program with when I did this program. Her family was from Turkey, but she considered herself to be German. But she explained to me that in Germany, she still wasn't fully German. German had like a specific definition that she didn't fit under. And I thought how odd and hurtful that must feel, because, I consider myself American, even though I was born in Mexico, but I grew up here. And I just think it's like, what do we have to do to like prove that we're part of the community? And we still have some of that in the US, of course, but at least I can proudly call myself American. Maybe not so proudly at this time, but usually. Gustavo, I wanted to ask you about the Bracero program, just because to build off the guest worker program, because it was a similar idea, right? Bringing migrants to fill a specific need. If you could talk a little bit about that, just in case people don't know what the Bracero program is.
Yeah, sure. In short, it was a guest worker program that I believe started in the 40s when there was labor shortages related to World War II. And I believe it ended around the 50s, 1964, thank you. But it was a program that brought a lot of Mexican labor to agriculture and to where there was a lot of need for laborers. And back then, the border was very different. Back then, the people who came and went, were different as because guest worker programs still exist in the U.S. And in fact, I have cousins who do this, picking apples in Washington State. But I know that my grandfather was part of this generation in the 40s and the 50s who would come to the U.S., work for a bit, and go back to Mexico. You know, the distance is a lot shorter between other countries. And so this was possible for them, and they had families back home. They were here to work and then to go back. Of course, this program ended, and similar programs exist now, but not to that degree.
Yes, and usually it's a special type of visa, right, where you can't stay. There's no adjustment of status to become a citizen. It's literally just seasonal work. I was also hoping you could talk a little bit about your own personal experience with migrating to the U.S. and what the integration experience has been like for you, and maybe what challenges you confronted when first coming here and even now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good question, and I can share my story, and it is my personal story, and it's one data point, but I hope it can be illustrative of what it is like today in the U.S., because we've been having a lot of these discussions about integration in Germany and in the U.S., and we never really defined what integration was. We never really defined when someone is integrated. And there's this subtle, or at least what I perceive, that the US has done a good job of integrating, in particular, for example, Mexican immigrants, which are the largest current immigrant group in the US. But personally, I faced many challenges. I was born in a rural area. My dad made it to 7th grade and my mom made it to 4th grade. Coming to the US, to a suburb of Chicago, where you have stoplights and you have stop signs and you have houses that all look the same. It's very hard when you grew up around cows and pigs and you don't have these things, right? So I remember, for example, one story when we were children is that we had someone who had already migrated. We had a lot of our community who was already there, who was helping my mom enroll us in school. And we walked to the school. It was just a few blocks away. And when we were coming back, we got lost. We couldn't find our own home. We were just walking around because we didn't know what our home was. And eventually my uncle found us just wandering around, and he picked us up and he took us to our own house. But it really, reflecting this now, sitting before you, I think it is an example of, in my family's experience, the integration, just to circle back to that, really happens from our own community. There weren't really a lot of social services that taught us these things. When I was a kid, I was my mom's translator. I was at the doctor's office with her. When my dad had an issue with a bill, I was the one yelling on the phone. As I was learning English myself, and these are very difficult positions. And I think the refugee resettlement program, for instance, is an amazing program. There's so much assistance, but that isn't something that is seen in other communities. And so for me and my family, it was challenges of just acculturation, of learning a whole new system, and then deciding that this was our new home, and then figuring it out from our own community, from people who had been here, who moved here 10 years ago. And other challenges, I think, are just similar challenges maybe to what Edith was saying, facing questions of, as you're rising in college, of belonging, of, being questioned in these spaces that you are. And again, I think it just circles back to doing a lot of these things. I think the fact that I'm here speaking before you is an exception to the rule and not a trend, that I was able to figure all these things out and navigate all these spaces through community members and family, but not through systematic programs.
Yeah, that's helpful. So something that you both touched on is the education aspect, how you see a lot of us maybe in elementary school and at the beginning of our educational career, but that doesn't really happen as we move along. And it also made me think of just like the conversations I would have with my mom in high school. My mom's expectation for me was, she would say, just graduate high school. That was it. There was no conversation about college. I didn't even really know what college was. I just knew that people went there after high school and I liked school, so I wanted to do it. But there was no path. I'm from rural Mexico, and then I moved to a rural place. So rural communities, I think, are often just under-resourced. So it was really difficult for me. And when I think back at, that was just my mom's worldview, because she had only completed 6th grade. Like for her, graduating in an American high school was like it. At the same time, she was an immigrant. She was a housekeeper. She couldn't afford college. And she would always say that to me. She's like, oh, you know, that's for like people who have money. She just didn't understand the realm of possibilities. I'm happy to say, and as you all know, I did go to college, I did go to law school, and that did shift the standard in my family. So now the standard in my family for all of my little brothers and sisters is you will go to college. That's the expectation. We'll find a way to make it go. But I just think about, you know, you really need to see somebody do it for even adults to understand what is possible. And then also just thinking like, I remember being very frustrated as a teenager, thinking like, why isn't my mom supporting me when I want to go to college? But then I have more empathy than when I look back now and understand that she made great sacrifices and she was just telling me what she knew. She didn't know. So I'm glad that we've both have moved forward. And in fact, she actually got her GED a couple of years ago and is also interested in college. So it just goes to show that, like, I always, you know, say this, it really does take just one person to like show people that it can be done, which actually makes me think, Gustavo, how did you enter into higher education? Because for me, it was really, really hard. And also culturally, I had to fight to like leave my house because many Latino households, many Mexican households, they don't like to see the girls leave the house. Traditionally, you're not supposed to leave the house until you're married. And my mom knew that was going to be a long ways away. But, you know, it was really hard to like fight to even go to college, to leave the house. It was 4 hours from my hometown. And I remember that within itself was another fight. And it was a literal fight with my parents to actually leave and pursue education. What was your experience like?
I think something very similar, and I think to first point to data, which I think is important, that thinking of integration for Hispanics, U.S. born and foreign born have the lowest college attainment rate in the U.S. Mark might be able to correct me, but I think about 25% of the Latino population, lower, 20? 15% has a college degree, and Latinos also have the highest college dropout rate, which I think is important to consider when we're thinking about integration in the US, especially with people with migration background. For me, I think it was just something me stumbling along. Similar to that, it was a fight with my own family of, you know, these cultural issues of leaving home. I have 5 siblings. I'm in the middle. My 3 oldest siblings, when they first arrived to the US, they went to high school and then they went to work. In order to support a family of 8, they all worked cutting grass around the Chicago area. And I just stumbled into things, and I think it was our own family supporting each other. I was able to not work and read more books and have a scholarship program that focused on low-income students, but my high school counselor never told me about this program. They never explained what it was. I even remember at the end when the school offered me acceptance, is this real? You know, there was no one to confirm this with, so it was just me figuring it out along. And I went away for 2 hours from my home, and my parents would visit me once every 6 months because it was very far for them to leave or to have the resources to do this. And it was a very different experience from my white American classmates who had their parents send them care packages, or they were buying them groceries for them every weekend, which again, just for me, I think it just reiterated that if I wanted to do these things, I had to work on my own. And it does highlight the importance of role models, because when you're doing this on your own, if you have people to look up for, it really does push you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move on to Victoria, who actually, you've already touched a little bit about this, but you have a very different experience than perhaps the other panelists here, just because of, I guess, how long your family has been in the US. And actually, Victoria wrote a wonderful piece in the Washington Post, I believe it was last year, and you should totally name drop that because everyone should read it. It was very well written, but she talked about her experience coming from the border and how her family has actually been there for generations. So I was hoping you could touch a little bit about that article and then just your unique experience.
Thank you. So about the article, really it was a reaction to the Trump administration separating children from their families in my hometown, McAllen. And even though I do not directly come from a migration background, I think if you grow up in the border area, you recognize that immigration is a normal part of life. The border, until very recently, was very fluid. And my uncle married my tia who is from Reynosa, and my other tia married a tia from Reynosa. And so you have families that are on both sides of the border, and the ideas and the culture is so fluid. And it's so much so that it's truly its own thing. And so what I would love to speak on is just that the generational perspective that I have from my family is just noticing the change that is happening, the militarization of the border, the way in which agents will ask you more questions at internal checkpoints, and the way that detention centers are cropping up in this region in the Southwest that historically has always detained brown people, starting with Native Americans and then the Japanese through internment camps. And that's deeply concerning to me. But also, if I were to tell the story of the border, it begins before there was ever any crisis on the border. The Texas border region is predominantly Latino, 90% for the most part. This stretches from El Paso all the way to where I am. That's a 13-hour stretch by car. And the state of Texas, I can only speak to Texas, has historically always underfunded this region, never put in infrastructure, roads or running water. In some places that still exists. Our schools have always been underfunded, and this isn't just a regional part. This isn't a regional problem in the most Latino part of the United States. This is a problem throughout the state. The state of Texas continues to underfund public education. So when we talk about integration, we have to talk about these structural problems. And my state is majority minority right now. It's not acting like it. And I think we brought up this point that there are no formal mechanisms for integration in the United States, but I would say that it might even be strategic the way that some of our state governments are funding education, healthcare, and various public services, knowing that the large and vast majority of beneficiaries are no longer white in some instances. So, the border is an interesting place. We can get more into it, but it's sad what's happening.
Yeah. So you talked a lot about Texas being a majority minority state, and I actually have a dear friend who's also from the border, and he talks about how he grew up on the border, and it was 98% Latino. So he's like, I didn't know that not everybody was Mexican American, because that was his experience. And then he came here to DC, and I went to school at Georgetown, and that was a cultural shock for him. And I just think how different my experience was, because I grew up in a rural community that was very, very white. So I didn't find people of color really until I got into spaces that I made for myself with more higher education. Actually, college for me was when I saw the most people of color, just to give you an idea of how deprived of that I was before. So I just was wondering about your own experience. So how do you find coming from a majority minority town to maybe somewhere like DC or somewhere where you are the minority? And I'm wondering, even though your family has been here for generations, what integration challenges do you still face as a minority in this country?
That's a really good question. I also grew up thinking that Latinos ran businesses, and Latinos were attorneys, and Latinos were members of Congress, and that's only because that was who was running our town, which I think was very empowering. So I think when I would come to cities like DC or now at my law school, I had a sense of, well, I'm supposed to run things too. And I quickly encountered that not all of my classmates had seen leadership in a body that looked like mine, that might be darker than mine, or had seen leadership or power when it is spoken through a voice that may have an accent. And that was very concerning to me. And I think microaggressions are persistent. And I think people ask me when my parents got here, and I don't necessarily take offense to that, but I think that it just shows that the level of understanding and nuance about the Latino experience in the United States is very limited. I currently attend a university where there's a tenure professor said that this country would be better off with more whites than non-whites, and said that we should have more immigrants from European origins, and said that Black Americans and Hispanics score lower on cognitive tests. That is the law school environment I'm at, an Ivy League law school. And so I think that maybe this will come out in other perspectives, but there will always be, I think, pushback no matter how high you rise. I'm fortunate that both my parents went to college and they are great resources. And so my ability to shield myself from a lot of this is, pretty good in comparison to some of my classmates who are first generation. And I can't even imagine what that experience would be like. But, I think we have a lot of work to do in getting America ready for this majority minority future we have around the corner.
Thank you. Nomaze, your work has focused a lot on how Germany can learn from its past. Based on what you've learned through your work and through this program, what do you believe the US and Germany can learn from each other regarding migration and integration?
First of all, I think that's a very complex question, and I don't know if I can answer it simply, because first of all, US and Germany both have a different understanding about what integration means. And America was from the beginning an immigration country where Germany recently began to accept this. For example, Germany had a long time a politics of isolation when you think about the 70s and about the labor migration. So I think there's a really nice quote from Max Frisch, a Swiss author. They came as guest workers but stayed as humans. So Germany didn't accept this fact at the beginning. And Germany's policies at that time resulted in isolated communities. In Germany, we spoke a lot about Parallelgesellschaften, but these isolated communities came because of Germany's politics at that time. But after the refugee crisis, Germany accepted to be or at least tries to accept that they are an immigration country. So, for example, Germany spends billions of euros for integration policies, like integration courses where you learn a lot about integration for people who come. And the past days, what I learned about integration here is that in the US, it's not the responsibility of the government to integrate these people. It's the responsibility from the immigrant to do so. So coming back to our question, what the Americans taught me is that the duality of identities is accepted here. Where in Germany, it's hard to say, like, I'm Arab German, because you are accepted to be just German, to be a good German. And
so could you identify as German? Would you feel comfortable identifying as German in Germany?
I am German, but the problem, so for me, I identify as German, but I also identify as Arab, like I'm not 50% German and 50% Arab. I'm 100% German and 100% Arab. And for some people, it's hard to understand this, but this is how I feel, because I'm both at the same time. And
yeah, do you think that'll change if more people from migrational background come to Germany? Do you think the duality? Do you think more people will be able to identify with dual nationalities?
I see a trend like in Germany, and I think it came from America. And this is something that we learned from America, I think. It's to accept both, because people earlier, I don't know if they could say I'm Turk and I'm German, because you had to choose. And now I heard from the society that you can be both. And I think that's a trend that actually came from America.
Oh.
Yeah, so we learned something from you guys.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you said that there are different definitions of integration in Germany and in the US.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about what in Germany that means. It sounds like integration there means maybe learning the language. Are there other things that the state is doing to promote integration and to define integration?
It's hard because for everyone, integration means something else. Like you can have a job and speak the language and have German friends, and then you are integrated. And for others, like a lot of people have a problem with being German and being Muslim. You know, for some people, you are not good integrated if you are still have your Muslim values. You know, so this is also a problem that we have in Germany, and I think in America it's for Mexican Americans easier because it's the same religion at least. And in Germany, this is like a problem to be Muslim and German.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's a really good point. And I also think it's easier on our side because there's just more of us and we have more of that history. There definitely is strength in numbers. Thank you for sharing
Like,
that.
I think in a few years, 40-50% will be in the America Mexicans, right? Like Mexican Americans.
Yeah, Mexican Americans are their largest Latino group in the US. I'm not really sure when the official takeover will come, but I feel like it's coming. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I was also like just curious about like your work. You said you've studied a lot about Germany's history. Is there anything that you feel that you should share with this room? Like maybe a pattern you noticed then that maybe is resurfacing? Anything along those lines?
Like, I work a lot with Muslim Jewish groups, and I think sometimes in Germany it's like, you know, anti-Semitism is something that just happened at the Holocaust and it disappeared after that. And I think the recent attack in Halle just showed us that it's still there and that we have to be like more achtsam, vigilant about our history, and don't just think that it's history, that it can repeat, you know, history can repeat, and we have to think about this.
Do you think there are a lot of spaces to have those conversations in Germany? When I ask that because when I did the program, I remember my German counterparts explaining that people are still afraid to talk about some of these issues. I could say the same thing about the US, though. I think that I've been really lucky to find the spaces where we have these hard conversations. But I think as a whole, a lot of people don't like to have the hard conversations.
Yeah, like the first space I found for me was actually in Berlin. I think in Berlin the people are way more progressive than in Bavaria. So I tried, sorry. So I tried to create a group for young people in Bavaria after my experience in Berlin. And I think we are doing a good job now because we are like 30 people, 40 people, I think. And we are doing educational trips or events about these topics. And we are trying to create a bubble for us, I think.
That's
a
great.
safe space.
That's great.
Yeah.
So this is just a general question for the panel. I was wondering what you all believe based on your personal experiences and in your participation in this program, what the successes and challenges of integration have been in the US and Germany, respectively. I'm sure there are many, but if you just want to name one or two. Anyone?
So as I mentioned on my mother's side, we don't know when we got here. But what I do know is that in my family, there were 3 generations of migrant farm workers, and my mother was the first to go to college. And I remember we went to the LBJ Museum in Austin, Texas, and she starts crying because they have done the 50th anniversary of the Great Society and all of the legislation that was passed. And she's like, why? I'm like, why are you crying? And she was like, if it hadn't been for all of this legislation and Pell Grants and making college more affordable, like you would not be here today. And I think that anecdote, though, again, one data point, and we have a long way to go till we make college accessible. I really can see in my family's story how making college more accessible, both through like the camp program, through Pell Grants, has helped. I think earlier generations of Mexican Americans and Latinos attain higher education, which has had ripple effects. But of course, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done.
Yep, sure.
As a success, I would say that the discussion, the debate in Germany developed in a quite well situation, or track. For example, the former state minister in Germany for integration, so on the federal level, Aydan Özuz, she once said that we need a integration policy in Germany for 80 million persons. So not only for this migrant group coming here, but for the whole society. And I would already consider this framing a success, because it is not only the sentence, but there comes a lot with it. Another challenge I would see, and what often occurs in panels or discussion forums on migration policies, is that often, or I do have this impression, I don't know the statistical data on this, but my impression is that in migration debates, often people with migrant backgrounds do participate. But what is also interesting is that a majority, or an important role, also receiving country citizens should participate, and not only as participants, but in leading scholar positions, for example. Also, the other way around, it should not only be that a person with migrant background should be state minister for integration, but also foreign minister or minister of interior, internal affairs, and so on. So this goes in both directions.
Well, first I'd like to comment on something I think, an observation from my perspective that I think Germany does well in integration is all the policies and all the systems and structures that have been created. I mean, on the previous panels, learning about, for example, Westphalia, right? A state of about 18 million people who spends millions of euros and dollars in, education programs, language, labor market integration, which I think, personally, I think it's something that the US needs more of. When you look at how long the US has been receiving migrants, right, since its inception, and you still see these statistics that Latina women, for example, make the lowest wages compared to the highest earners in the US. The wage gap between them is huge, or just institutional or generational wealth, or these low education rates in the US among Latinos and other immigrant groups. I think it still highlights that there isn't an investment in policies, which I think that is a challenge that we still have.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We have never invested in communities of color in the US, and we still do not. People on this panel have touched on that. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. I also was wondering if you all just had any ideas on what was missing from today, from this conference, from any of these panels or presentations. I had a couple of thoughts. So I think something that we don't talk about enough is just how your integration experience is actually very much informed by just your phenotype, like how you present to the world. So for example, in my family, I have dark skin, but my sisters have lighter skin. And I remember growing up, I would hear things that were racist, that were very offensive, that really hurt me. And my sisters didn't even catch it. Like it was not like something that they were aware of, but they never had to be aware of that because they were light skinned. They never had to think about skin color. And I think about how perhaps for them, well, I know for them, their integration experience was different, and they probably didn't observe the same things I observed when I was younger that informed who I am today. And I think that's something that we need to talk about, just because, your proximity to the majority, your proximity to whiteness does give you more privileges in this society. And I imagine it's maybe similar in Germany. I don't know if you all want to speak to that. But I think that's something that we definitely need to discuss when we're talking about migration, because it does play a role in how you're perceived. Even what people said on this panel, that although your family has been here for generations, because of the way that you look, people might ask about your background. So I think that's something that we should dig deeper into. And I understand we were limited, but that was something I would be curious to engage in, a conversation I'd be curious to engage in. Something else I think that should be talked about is just media representation. Um, so, you know, we do see conversations around immigration and migration on the news and that sort of thing, but the pundits, the people who are talking about these issues, are rarely people who look like me or look like anybody on this panel. And first of all, we need to start there. That we need to have migration, like people from migrational backgrounds, people who who understand that history, speaking on news channels. But we also need to have us speaking on all issues, not just immigration and integration. Media representation is just really, really lacking. Media is very influential, so I think it would be really neat to have a conversation about that. Actually worked on a report last year about how people of color are portrayed in American media, and what I found was that Latinos are rarely represented in a positive light in the news, rarely, very rarely. And when they are portrayed in the news at all, it's usually related to crime or immigration. So there are very few positive news stories that come out about Latinos generally. And we could say the same thing about media outside of the news. So if you look at movies, if you look at TV shows, it's astonishing to me that we are the largest minority population in the US, but media is so far behind. We're never represented. Stories are never about us. It's really like shocking to me that that still happens. It's getting better, but I think it's definitely not where we need to be, especially because there are a lot of negative stereotypes. And I think having positive representation of Latinos and people of color would help reframe a lot of these political conversations. For example, immigration has been a really difficult topic in the US lately. But I feel that if we had more positive representation and if people were able to see us as members of their community and stopped othering us through media representation, those conversations wouldn't be as toxic anymore. So yeah, did you all have any thoughts on anything I just said, or what you would like to see in a future conference on this issue?
Yeah, I would have two aspects. So the first one is what you mentioned with regard to how people look like. When I came to Washington the first time, so just on Sunday, I got the secondary check, and I went to a room where only people who do not look very white were sitting and waiting until the police officer asked them some questions. So that is, at least for my impression, easier in Germany than it is here. And the second thing I wanted to say is the electoral participation of migrants or foreigners, so migrants who do not have the citizenship of a country, on the local level. So in Germany, for example, we have, as I already said, some classes where you have 30%, say, people with a migrant background, and they all were born in the same city. They grew up together and so on. However, also for basic decisions like, do we want to pool here or not? Or how do we want to build this road? Some of them are not allowed to participate in elections like this on the local level, and some are. And I would say that there should be some changes in regulation that, at least on a local level, residents who live there since a number of years, officially and legally, should be allowed to participate in these local elections. And the reason for that is participation. So participation is not only discussing and being in the community, but also engaging in elections actively and passively. And yeah, because doing so, you have a closer link maybe to your community, because you can also decide what's going on. Yeah, I think that this would strengthen the integration in both ways.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's definitely a way to integrate people. If we're talking about integration, they are community members who should have a voice. In the US, A couple of cities have tried that, where they've actually given undocumented people who live in the community the chance to vote in local elections. I think that's a great idea and something that should be further explored. Did anybody else on this panel have other ideas of what you'd like to see included in future conferences or panel discussions on migration or integration?
I think for me, the first time it was really hard to hear about undocumented people because we Germans love bureaucracy, so it's hard for us. But how can these people don't have documents, you know? So it's it is. So it's still really hard for me to understand this, and I think I'd like to have to hear more about it because I still can't understand it. I'm sorry. Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I think to kind of add on what Mace was saying is questions on the, I think something to add is to do more comparisons between the US and Germany. So for example, on documentation status, are these cultural differences about how we see, so we've been talking about how similar and how close Germany and the US are, but I think it's also important to highlight all these differences. I spent 3 months this summer in Berlin working at the IOM, and just speaking with some of my German coworkers, something that they had a hard time wrapping their head around was the idea of birthright citizenship, for instance. They thought it was very strange that you were just born here, you could just live here, or naturalization, from what I understand, it is a more difficult process in Germany. But even still here, some may say that it's quite easy to become a US citizen, and there's all these systems in place to do it. And what Edith said as well, civic engagement is it's a big issue that we talk about. Latinos have some of the lowest voter participations and voter registration numbers. And even among Mexicans, for instance, have the lowest naturalization rates. My parents never became US citizens for many important reasons. And I think, now where I live in San Diego, which is a border city that has a huge Latino and other immigrant population, the city councils of some places, the people making local decisions don't reflect this community. And I think that's something that is important to discuss as well. Next, after getting a job, after getting an education, is being put in a place where you can make decisions for your community.
To build off of that, parity. So how can both of our countries lessen the time or generations it takes for our minority groups to have parity with the majority in terms of generational wealth, education, because there are still disparities long after people get here.
Yeah, it makes me think of all these recent studies that have come out on just the racial wealth gap, and it makes me think of Black Americans who have also been here for generations, but still are not fully integrated. We have disallowed them as a society to become fully integrated, and the disparities are very, very distinct. So thank you for sharing that. My last question for you all before we before we turn it over to the audience for questions, is just to give your reflections on this program, on the Diversity Leadership Exchange Program, your thoughts, and positive reflections, I guess. Anything you want to share? Yeah.
First of all, it was very, very interesting to get a deeper understanding in migration and integration policies in the US firsthand. Not only on textbooks for school or online research or whatever, or doing such stuff, but talking to people is always much better than reading about them. I think we had a lot of experiences like this. What is a central takeaway for me is that we might have some different backgrounds, very, very high variety, but often the experiences we have are very similar, and the challenges we face And I also think that both sides have learned or could learn some, something on how these challenges can be handled, and what could have or what we could do in future. Yeah.
I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, particularly because transatlantic relations, I think when we think of who the scholars and thought leaders are, they don't usually look like people on this panel. And so I really appreciate this recognition that we need to open up the space and let the future leaders who are diverse enter into it and begin these what are hopefully lifelong conversations. And it never occurred to me how novel that was until this week. So thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to echo Edip and Victoria. I mean, I am sincerely grateful to AICGS for this opportunity because we were put in spaces that I don't think we normally would be. Speaking yesterday at the German embassy, speaking to some US officials who work on migration issues, learning from a lot of different think tanks. I think it was a very enriching experience. But most of all, my biggest takeaway is learning from the German participants and the US participants, because we have very different experiences, and learning all the differences. We were reflecting over, people asking you where you are from, or, like what it is like to grow up with immigrant parents in a very different society. And I think it's something that does enrich this experience, and it does hopefully will inform my work on migration.
I loved the program, to be honest. Like, I really loved it. The places where we went, the people that I met, and I think Liz and Susan did a great job with the whole program. And also, my biggest takeaway, like you said, are the people that I met, like you guys. And yes, I really, really liked it because I study a lot about Middle Eastern politics because of my background. And I didn't thought, to be honest, a lot about the Hispanic population here in America. So when I came here, it's not like the same when I go, because I learned like a lot about the Hispanic population here, and I'm really, really grateful for this.
Thank you. I will say one thing that I really enjoy about this program is just that I think in the US, we're very guilty of being very US centered. Probably not the people in this room because you guys are at an international conference, but I work in the domestic policy space, and growing up here, like everyone is super US centered to the point where people promote monolingualism, like just knowing one language. When I'm like, do you realize that the rest of the world speaks multiple languages? I think that this is very educational for especially US Americans. And I know for me, it made me definitely think outside of the US, which I'm very guilty of a lot. So again, I'm also very thankful to have been part of this program. And now we'll open it up. We have about 20 minutes for questions, and it looks like we have a lot. So we have a mic back there. We'll start with this woman in the front. Yeah.
First, just a quick reality check. Schleswig-Holstein and Hamburg tried to introduce voting rights for non-citizens in 1983. The Constitutional Court rejected it, so now it would require a constitutional amendment in Germany to change that provision. I want to stick with the political, though, because that's the part that I have found missing in a lot of this. Everybody's complaining about the policies of Twitler, and I share that concern. But Black Lives Matter called for a voting boycott in 2016. As a result of that, 20% fewer blacks in this country voted in the 2016 presidential elections. My son, a millennial, the son of this mother, think about that one, said he wasn't going to vote because Bernie was not the candidate. I said, a 74-year-old white guy who's been in Congress for 26 years, that's supposed to be diversity. So what are you doing in your age group among those who have the right to vote to mobilize these people, because that's the only way we're going to get rid of the jerk on this side, and that's the only way you're going to put a lid on the AFD on the other side. Thank you.
So prior to law school, I worked in the United States Senate, and a large part of my role was strategizing how we could get our chief of staff to very rural, majority minority areas and not. So places that people might have forgotten. And the reason I did that is because I know growing up in a place where most of your interactions with government revolve around, are you a US citizen or not? That doesn't really build a lot of trust or confidence or reliability in your government. And so when I was on the inside, I did try to get government to be a mechanism that would listen and would engage and start the conversation rather than come to us when something goes wrong. Like, let's be proactive. So that's been my mentality working in government, though I'm hoping to work outside of government and sue states someday. So I'll give you an update on that.
I think that's a really good question, and I think it's a really important issue, especially as I keep mentioning, Latinos, for instance, have a already very low voter participation rate. And I think a lot of the discussions we've been having are about having role models and community participation. But I think it is important to challenge that a bit, because I don't think that onus should be on us necessarily. Especially, I've been in many different spaces where I'm the only Latino, the only minority, and people come to me to work on issues of diversity. And it feels a bit unfair to bear the disadvantages of that and then to be the one to come up with a solution. So I think it is important to frame it around, well, this is a society that we're all part of. I think we need to have structures that lift up our voices, such as this panel, but also structural issues that come from the other side. And I think that's something important to consider.
That is a really good question. And I just wanted to add that there are a couple of real challenges. One challenge being that a lot of Latin American migrants come from countries where they didn't believe in the political system. They didn't believe they have been, the democratic process let them down time and time again. And I know for my mom, it took a while to convince her to vote and that her vote actually mattered. And I'm proud to say that my family is a voting family now, but that took a lot of education. But I understand that given the context. And my fear is that because of what's been happening politically in the US lately, that people will feel further discouraged. I hope that doesn't happen. I always try to be positive and somebody who tries to, say how important these things are. But we can do so much, but if the government isn't investing to make sure that our people can vote, there's only so much we can do. So if we're talking about divesting from communities of color, our communities have to wait in long lines to vote. Our communities have to travel, take time off work, do things that other communities don't have to even think about to vote. So it's really hard for us to actually do it without the government putting forth the same effort. But there have been legal challenges to voting rights in the US. So, the reality is that we can push, and I know that our community does push, but we have some real structural barriers that we need to overcome. Some of these being legal barriers, but again, it's been historic divestment and just the fact that it is very challenging for us to vote. It's very challenging for us to get to the polls in the first place.
I'm Eric Langenbacher from AICGS, and I wanted to ask a question about another migrant group, which are Asian Americans. So it was pointed out that Latino Americans have very low college rates, although I seem to recall that in a 5-year period, the rate went from 10 to 15%, so there might be generational effects that are now kicking in. But if you look at Asians from an educational perspective, they are the most successful group in the United States. Over 50% have at least 4 years of college. They have slightly higher rates than the average for high school completion. So I think that the Asian American experience of migration has been very different. And my understanding is that many migrants from Asia are coming from a different class background, that they're already kind of middle class, coming from more educated families to begin with. And so I wanted to throw out there the whole variable of class, right? We talk a lot about intersectionality and intersectional identities, but I can't help but think that a lot of the stories, the wonderful stories that I'm hearing, are less about Latino identity and more about a specific class identity. So I'm just wondering, to what degree has class played a role in your kind of experiences? And the same goes for our kind of Germans on the stage as well. And also, I mean, this goes back to kind of politics, and I can't help but think that it's maybe it's time to kind of return to a different kind of politics that actually takes class very seriously, in addition to the ethnic identities that we all have.
I'll just do a quick response because I think it's something that in academia and in think tanks we tend to do a lot because it's very easy to do a tabulation of educational attainment by race or ethnicity and group these groups. But I think it is important, and I cannot speak to this since I am not a part of this community, but it's part of being able to disaggregate that data on Asian American attainment. While it's true that as an aggregate group, they have some of the highest household incomes and educational attainment, I think when you also disaggregate it, for instance, in San Diego, there's a lot of Asian refugee groups, or in other Californian communities that have low attainment. And so I think that's important to consider. But on the issue of class, I think from my perspective and my experience, I think it's very hard to disentangle race, ethnicity, and class in the US. I mean, these are all very messy, ambiguous concepts that are hard to pull apart. I come from a lower class background, and I have classmates who in my university are from the upper class in Mexico. They may look the same as me. They may have the same skin tone. They may have had very different experiences, but they might still be treated the same if we walk into a store. And I think these structural systems are in place that are hard to really disentangle. But I agree. I think class is an important issue to consider, especially when we think about where we're coming from. Mexico is a very racist and classist society. And it seems like when we come to the US, we are erased of all these backgrounds, but we are still linked to these systems.
I want to be clear that when we advocate for diverse communities, that doesn't mean we're also not advocating for low-income white Americans either. I think the whole point, if we're being comprehensive and intersectional, is just to make sure that every identity has the support that they need to be successful. And I would very much agree with what you're saying. I think that I grew up pretty middle class for the most part. My dad is an academic. But I will say that there are moments where it doesn't matter what degrees my dad has, or it doesn't matter what degrees I will have. I will face a glass ceiling in my career, particularly in the legal field, much earlier than a white woman would have, regardless of her background. And there are statistics, particularly in my profession, that show that. So I agree. I don't think you can disentangle it.
For the case of Germany, I would say, so to the class debate, I would say that it is interesting to look in the history because, as I said, the largest minority group in Germany are Turkish, with backgrounds as being Turkish guest workers, for example. And the interesting thing about this is that in the 60s and 70s, the very high-skilled Turkish did not come to Germany. They went, for example, to Canada. Sorry? Yeah, or the United States. And Germany just needed some, say, cheap workers and unskilled workers, and they're cheap. And this is also what, of course, changes over time, but very slowly changes over time. And it is very difficult to step into a higher class. When it comes to politics, this is also highly interesting because being workers, most Turkish guest workers and guest workers in general in Germany used to vote for the Social Democratic Party. But with the time passing, we can see that this drops since many elections, and they go for very different parties, which is, in my point of view, of course, bad for Social Democrats, but a good sign of integration.
Hi, so my name is Humberto Ramos, and I currently work for the U.S. House of Representatives in the district office in Arizona. And I'd just like to comment back to the first question that was asked about getting youth to participate in the voter process. We have to look at the overall complexities of it, right? So currently in my state, there's a lot of voter suppression happening, and that is tied to voter ballot harvesting laws. And I recently went to a district field hearing, and it was very interesting that the state senator who introduced the law, I won't name her, actually, when she was being asked by the other congressional members about how many people brought up the issue to her to introduce this bill, she said only a dozen out of the whole state. So it's very hard when, like how Gustavo said, to not put the whole pressure on the youth community. But when we have our own leaders introducing laws that add to the surmounting the issues that we face as youth, it's hard when I guess adults are not, not helping at the same time. So it's something that's not talked about because it is at the state level. So state issues and those, and there's even laws where voting centers are not being placed in impoverished communities that give them the ability to vote. And the practice of voter harvesting, I think, would assist with that, with getting volunteers, and then the youth gets introduced to volunteering in these areas so that everyone's ballot is able to be counted. And at the same time, you create this movement that, everyone, that it shouldn't be just a youth issue, but a general issue for the whole community.
Thank you. Karen Johnston, American University. Mays, you touched on a issue that I was thinking about, and that's the issue of these hyphenated identities. In America, probably just because we're an immigrant country, for a very long time people were Irish American or German American or whatever, and that. But the dilemma, I think, is it's sort of an understanding that if you're 100% German and 100% Arab, what symbols or ways of self-identification can be very important. So Thomas Risse at the Freie Uni once talked about EU identity as a marble cake that is sort of not layered but mixed. But do you see, for maybe in the future, that see, again, the perception of what a hyphenated name would be in the German context as opposed to the American context. Do you see it, perhaps the self-identification for immigrant communities and over the longer term, over the generations, to be something where to say I am German means that whether you're Arab or Turkish or Syrian or maybe even Irish or French doesn't matter, that you are German, or whether there is something to this acknowledgement of your duality by saying, I am, Arab German, I am Irish German, and have that as a kind of self-identification that would be acceptable. I'm trying to understand sort of, and even for the Americans, does it matter? When someone says I'm German American, does it matter? I know I'm American, yes. Do hyphenated names have any other kind of meaning now than they did, 50 years ago in America?
I think that's a hard question, and I'm thinking about it a lot because I had my crisis about identity. But for me, it's like, in Germany, we say, I'm German, but my parents are from Iraq. So that's political correct in Germany. For me, it's, I don't know, I'm the same like my parents, you know? My parents are not from another place, so we are the same. And so for me, it's like I want to be able to say I'm German without to explain anything. And I want also to be able in German to say I'm Arab without to be like, but I'm German also, because I'm both. And I want both to be accepted, you know, because so I don't know if I have to say I'm Arab German. Maybe for others this will be easier to understand, but for me it's like I just want to say I'm Arab or I'm German, and it's okay for people, so I don't have to explain myself, and that people just accept this.
I guess I'll add my perspective to that is for me, I'm very proud to identify as Mexican American, but I'm also very proud to identify as Latina. So for me, like I can't. I guess it does depend on the crowd I'm speaking to, but I will never like. I rarely self-identify as American. I did for this panel because of like the topic we're talking about, but for me, it's really important, especially in these times, to say I'm Mexican, especially because we don't often get to be in these spaces. So I take a lot of pride in that. So I know for me, like that is my entire identity, and like the hyphen matters, and the hyphen matters also because I also understand that I'm not Mexican from Mexico. Like I in Mexico I would be considered totally American, so it's explaining the two parts of me that I am. So for me the hyphen matters.
I identify as Texan. Kidding.
That's like being Bavarian.
We've made that connection over the course of this week, of course.
This is very similar to what I wanted to say, because when anyone asks me where are you from, my first answer is not Germany or Turkey or whatever. My first answer is Mannheim, because I'm born there, I was raised there, and so on, and I identify with the city, not in the sense of a nation or ethnicity and so on. I mean, I could also say I'm German or Turkish or European or and so on. So this is one thing, and the second thing is that self-identification is, of course, not something which you. I mean, you don't wake up and think about, what am I now? Yeah. And it's also when, or I guess my experience is that when we are in the countries of our grandparents, for example, we are the Germans, and when we're here, we are the Turkish, and so on. So it's very difficult to, to make that clear.
I just want to clarify my answer. I think the reason why, no, I think the reason I'm so drawn to Texas is because of the like rich Mexican American history that is there, and that does mean a lot to me because my family has lived in the same place for 100 years, and so I really identify with that. And I'm just, I believe I'm not giving up on my state, so here we are.
And just to add my perspective, I think it is a really interesting question, and I've studied identity a lot and thought a lot about it. But for me, I came to the U.S. when I was 10, so for a long time, I always was very proud Mexican, and I think also because I struggled a lot and to be where I am, and so I always, and people told me this as well, like, you should be very proud of where you're at because you're Mexican or because you came from this place, and it can be a little offensive sometimes, but sometimes it was reaffirming. But when I had lived here longer than I lived in Mexico, when I turned 20, I had like an identity crisis. Like, what am I now? I have lived here now longer and longer than I ever lived in Mexico. Even though my parents live in Mexico, I go there twice a year. And I always identify first as Mexican, American, but I lived 3 months in Berlin this summer, and I realized all the American things the values that I have, and externally people confirming this, and I felt proud of that as well. And I have never felt, even when I tell people I'm Mexican and American, I have never felt people question that or made me feel bad for that. So I think that is something important to say, that it's okay for me to say I was born in Mexico and I am from Chicago. It has never been questioned.
Yes, thank you. My name is Leon Dieplang. I'm a research fellow at the IRCGS, just as Catherine. And I was wondering, you told us a lot of story anecdotes where people ask you questions which seemed as though they thought that you didn't match their expectations of integration. And so I thought it would be interesting to turn the question around and give it to you, and probably that you could tell us what for you makes a successful integration. Is it some hard factors? Is it like just living there? Is it like education, have friends there? Or is there at all an end to this integration, or will it like be an everlasting question? That I think would be very interesting for you to answer with your specific backgrounds. Thank you.
So usually my problem with the word integration is that people mostly just mean people of color with it. So when someone from French or Dutch come, you don't expect them to be good integrated. Usually you just mean Arabs, Turks, Kurds, whatever, or people from East Europe have, I think, the same problem sometimes. But when someone comes from French or Dutch, you don't ask them like, are you good integrated? So even when I think about my little sister and she's born in Germany, does she have to integrate? Does she has to integrate, or isn't she just? So this is like a little bit my problem with the word integration. And what means good integration? I don't know. When you speak the language, when you have a job, when you went to high school, when you, like say in German, when you are a Verfassungspatriot. I don't know how to say it in English, like constitutional patriot. So when you love the Grundgesetz. Yes, but I think it's for everyone different. But what's for me important is that we usually just accept, we just want people of color to integrate, and this is a problem.
Just really quickly, from a researcher perspective, I think there are many markers that we can track. And we focus a lot on language and we focus on a lot of work, but I think some of the earlier panels also kind of dove deeper into the value of that job, whether it's a quality job. And Victoria also touched on this, on parity, you know, that these gaps that continue for generations. For me, good integration would be reducing these gaps, that they don't continue for generations.
Time, but I think we did have one more, so we'll probably just do one more question just because I don't want to keep you all over. Oh, I thought we had another question. Maybe not. All right, well, I think this concludes the panel. Thank you guys so much.
I want to add a few words of thanks. I won't try to sum up our deliberations today because we've covered so much ground that it would be, it would take too much time, and I think it might tax me a little too much at this time of the day. But I think this has been a very fruitful day of discussions. We've identified a number of challenges that Germany and the United States share. Some of these are practical. Some of them have to do with self-conception, which I think we've delved into quite a bit in this last 90 minutes. But I think we also can recognize real elements of progress that we can see in Germany and in the United States, even as we recognize that they are incomplete and imperfect. So I think that is important to keep in mind. I think we've also seen how much we have in common in Germany and the United States, even if the manifestations of particular challenges may take different forms. But we're basically working on the same issues and in the same direction. And before I do a round of thank yous, here in yellow on this banner, what we're about is building a stronger German-American partnership, and I think today's conference has been a great contribution to that, because we need to move forward with a deeper understanding of how these issues affect the United States and Germany, and how we can take those commonalities and work on them together. My thanks go to our presenters, not just to the 4 we've had here and our moderator, Maritza, but to the first 2 panels. I'm very grateful for people taking their time and bringing their experience and their perspectives. I want to thank the AT&T Foundation, which supports our exchange program. So thanks very much to the AT&T Foundation. I want to thank all of you who have attended and those who've been watching through our live stream. And I also want to offer a big thanks to Susanna Dieper and to Liz Carruth, who have made all of this happen. And so thanks to all of you. And we look forward to the next opportunity to see you, whether it's in Washington or Germany or somewhere else. Thanks for being with us.